everyone. Welcome to week 6. For this week, we are going to be taking a look at Canada treaties. So it's really important to keep in mind that First Nations treaty making has existed for thousands of years. So pre-contact with colonists, First Nations people have been doing treaties since pretty much time immemorial. And oftentimes the ceremonies and items used within these treaty-making processes differed from culture to culture. So what the Tsimshian would do would be different than, say, what was done by the Blackfoot people on the plains. But oftentimes they followed kind of a general format. Now, please keep in mind that in all of this is very generalized things. I'm not going to be going into kind of details about kind of treaties. Instead, we're going to be just looking at it as a whole. But the general format included an introduction, there were gifts that were given, time was spent together to actually get to know the other person before you made your treaty, there were negotiations, and then the formalization of the treaty through usually a pipe ceremony. And after this ceremony, the treaty was seen as tri-party, an agreement between the two parties and the creator themselves. Now, before Canada became a country, when colonists first arrived in North America, they did start kind of making treaties, and most of it had to do with land. The first one that had to kind of do with that was the Royal Proclamation of 1763. So what this was, is it provided protection for First Nations territories by establishing First Nations quote-unquote hunting grounds. Basically, it was a way for the British government to have control over North America, and basically made it so that no European settlement, occupation, or infringement would be permitted on these quote-unquote hunting grounds without the consent of the Crown, basically the British government. The proclamation actually recognized First Nations occupation and the use of the territory not already treated. This also established what is referred to as a trust relationship between the Crown and the First Nations by stating only the Crown could purchase land from the First Nations. So oftentimes when we talk about treaties, we usually refer to the treaties we're going to talk about, which are the ones between the federal government and the First Nations. So what those were, they were negotiations in trust. It's called a trust relationship. That's trusting that each group will fulfill the obligations stated in that treaty. So on kind of the basis of these negotiations, this is again very, very generalized. First Nations oftentimes would receive hunting and fishing rights, reserved lands, and an education in a colonist sort of education society. So what did the government get? So the federal government got land for farming and settlement, natural resources, and a peaceful expansion. So there was 11 sort of major treaties that were signed in Canada. This is looking at some of that, one of those treaties. This is treaty number 4. Now this is a lot of jargon. I just want you to kind of look at the yellow part. So basically this is the government's way of saying, okay, so this is what we want the treaty to say. So I'm just going to read the yellow part. So it says that this group of First Nations do by cede, release, surrender, and yield up to the government of the Dominion of Canada for Her Majesty the Queen and her successor forever all the rights, titles, privileges whatsoever to land, including within the following limits, giving a description of the territory. Basically what this meant is the First Nations were giving up all rights and titles and claims that they had to the land. In exchange for that, there were reserves to said, you'll notice on here they use the term Indians, because remember that was a term used back in the day, which is now considered very much a derogatory term. So we have that each First Nations person would get sufficient area to allow 1 square mile for each family of 5, or in that proportion of larger or smaller families. So imagine you are a group of people. You've just spoken to the government of Canada and they give you this really long document. And it says all these words such as cede, release, surrender, yielding up to the Dominion of Canada and Her Majesty the Queen. Do you think you probably have any idea what that actually means? How much is actually being taken from you? And this is the issue in all of this. A lot of these treaties were very heavily jargoned for the purpose of taking more than they seemed. We also had conditions of the treaty, briefly stated, and there's a bunch of different things from money to given to each chief, an annual payment of security, presenting of clothing, ammunition, agricultural implements, reserves to be selected. The 7th one is kind of interesting. Schools to be established on each reserve as soon as the Indians settled thereon. This is an important point because what the federal government wanted to do is it wanted to educate these First Nations people in the colonist ways. So they first promised that there would be schools on each reserve. This didn't necessarily happen because what they found is that the First Nations people didn't really necessarily want to change all of their ways of life that they had been doing for thousands and thousands of years. So the seventh one didn't necessarily happen. Well, it did, just didn't happen on those reserves, and those children were taken instead. Now this right here is a map. These are the 11 major treaties that exist in Canada. So you'll notice that in Upper and Lower Canada, there were some treaties, but I just want you to look at the 11 treaties, the ones in green. So these treaties pretty much existed from about 1871 to 1921. That's a pretty long period of time in which these were being made. You'll notice that Treaty number 1, it's right at the bottom of Manitoba. That's the Red River settlement. You'll kind of notice that. And then they kind of expand from there. You'll notice, if we look to where Prince Rupert is on the west coast, there were no treaties signed between the government and the First Nations people. That's why we often use the term unceded. That means that the land has not been negotiated or given up by the First Nations people to the Crown. You will notice, though, on Vancouver Island that there are the Douglas Treaties. We'll get to those a little bit later. So this right here is a more or less timeline. We're not going to go too much into detail, but it just gives you a bit of a sense of how long this has been going on. I have a copy of this, which I'm attaching to Edmodo, so you guys can take a look. The part that we're kind of sort of focusing on is between the 1800s and the 1900s. And there were a bunch of treaties, so you can see the Royal Proclamation, the Unnamed Treaties, the Douglas Treaties, the Numbered Treaties. There was a lot of different treaties because the government wanted the land. And it seems that they thought that the easiest way to do that was through laws that the First Nations didn't always fully understand. Because what the government was trying to do is it was trying to take that land, and it was going to do it by any means necessary. So for your assignment this week, each of you is going to be looking at one of the numbered treaties. I'll explain it a little bit more. So what you're going to do, either by yourself or if you'd like, we're going to try this out. If you want to work with a partner, so they do half of it and then you work on half of it, that's totally fine with me. Just let me know if you're going to work in partners because it's going to be a little more interesting. You're going to create a short presentation. Now, you're not actually necessarily presenting this, you're just putting the information onto a PowerPoint or a Prezi about one of the 11 treaties in Canada. So the first thing you need to do, this is kind of your list of things you need to do. The first thing you need to do is you need to choose one of the 11 numbered treaties in Canada. Basically, if you go onto Google and you type in Treaty number 3, Canada, it'll give you the information on that. Gather the points in point form for the 7 questions that you need. You'll notice on your assignment sheet that there's already a note sheet afterwards to kind of help you with that. The reason I want you to do it in point form is because I don't want you copy and pasting all of this information just into a Word document. We call that plagiarism. So don't copy and paste entire sections from the internet, because if you do that, it's really easy for me to go in and see that you've done that, and I have to give you 0 on the project. So if you do want to say copy like a quote because you think it's really interesting, put quotation marks around the link with a link to the website. So as though you are citing the source and then tell me where you got it from. So what you gather for all 7 questions, you're going to create a PowerPoint or Prezi with those 7 questions. Keep the information in point form. Make it simple and easy to read. So you're basically just taking the notes that you have, putting them onto a PowerPoint. Make sure to add a picture to each of the slides. Make it look interesting. Notice how in my PowerPoints, they're not jam-packed with tons of information. And if they are, it's oftentimes I'm highlighting what you need to know. The last thing you need to do is you need to complete a bibliography on the last slide. There needs to be a link to all the sources that you use. Again, I know that this is not coming out of your head, so you need to tell me where you got that information. So these are your 7 questions that you need to look up. The first thing you need to do is you need to tell me which treaty you're doing and the date that it was signed. There might be multiple dates. If there are multiple dates, maybe pick the first date and the last date and then just say that there were dates in between. Don't do all of them. Some of them they'll have multiple because they got signed in multiple places. Okay, where was the treaty signed? Why was this location selected? You might not necessarily find why it was selected, but you will be able to find where the treaty was signed. Again, if you have multiple dates and multiple signing places, just pick a couple of them. Number 3, who was involved in this? So what First Nations groups were involved in this? You can easily find this information if you go to the Wikipedia link from the assignment. Scroll down, it'll tell you some of the major groups that were involved. Number 4, what was included in the treaty making process? Were there multiple meetings? Were there issues with these meetings? Because a lot of them they did. Were the First Nations very willing to do this? Was the government super pushing this? Were there protests? That's what I'm asking of that. Number 5, what promises were made by the Canadian government in this treaty? What did the government say they were going to do? You should be able to find this information if you go to the Canadian Encyclopedia site. Number 6, what did the First Nations groups have to give up? And what did they get in return? So part of this is kind of part of number 5, but the big part for number 6, how much land did they have to give up? And number 7, this one is more, I want to see why you think, or how is this treaty still significant today? So what I recommend is you actually look up this treaty and see if you can find anything in the news. When I say significant today, it can be anything pretty much from like 2000 onward. If you have any questions, please make sure to check in with me. For this week for Zoom, I would love you guys to check in if you do have questions, or simply email me or text me. Hopefully you guys will be able to do the assignment, and I look forward to seeing what you guys come up with.